This is a 1660 Super, and we're gonna test it in games people actually play here in 2024. Well, mostly. We will throw a couple of wrinkles in there because, you know, we wanna see what the graphics card can do, but we don't wanna leave out games like Fortnite and Warzone because people actually play those a lot on PC, and those games don't get benchmarked by a lot of the benchmarking channels. So this graphics card was released at a time where nvidia was popping out graphics cards left and right. I think they released almost 12 graphics cards in this year, which was like 2019. The 1660 Super specifically was released in October of that year. And we all know what happened in 2020, so who knows how much worse it would have been had nvidia not released, 12 graphics cards in 1 year. Now, the 1660 Super only has 6 gigabytes of VRAM, and a lot of people these days would totally complain about that because they think you need at least 12, but with AMD having a lot of cards with 16 gigabytes available, that's what everybody thinks you need. But I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at what 6 gigabytes can do in a lot of the popular games that people actually play these days. And considering that it only requires a 300 watt power supply, at least that's what's recommended by nvidia, this graphics card can be put in a lot of different budget scenarios where you can have a nice 1080p gaming rig to play, pretty solid FPS numbers on esports and a pretty solid playable experience on those story mode games. Now, for our testing purposes, we used our trusty test bench with an i5 12600K. We've been using the CPU pretty much all of 2024 so far. I know Intel's got, some issues with the higher end 14th gen and the 13900K, but the 12600 is a great CPU that we can use for our testing. It's still a good option. It's just not as good as it used to be because now the upgrade path is tainted. And we use 32 gigs of RAM, DDR5, 5600 megahertz. So now let's hop into some of those games. So we tried Warzone at 1080p. Most of our benchmarks are at 1080p because in AAA games, you're just not gonna wanna stretch this 1660 Super into 1440p or 4K. Although we did try it in some of the esports. So in Warzone, we started with ultra settings and we didn't use any upscaling because a lot of people always gripe when we use upscaling in FPS games. At least for the first few settings, we didn't use it. So in ultra, we got like 55 to 60-ish FPS, which I was actually really shocked by with only 6 gigabytes of VRAM that we could even get close to 60 FPS with the 1660 Super. It did pretty well. Then we went to our balance settings. Again, these are all the presets, but we did turn upscaling off. And we got like 65 to 70 FPS. But then we dropped it to basic. We don't really do minimum because if you drop it to the minimum presets, it lowers your render resolution. So on basic preset settings, we were able to get around 75 to 80 FPS, which is kind of that mark where you really start to see the best jump from anything over 60 FPS. If you can get to 75 FPS, that is a really nice jump and can make a big difference between 60 and 75. At least that's what the research I've read says. But of course, we had to at least try FSR one time, so we used FSR 3.0 on this. That's the best upscaler, I believe, for these older NVIDIA cards, on Warzone at least. And we were able to get 100 to 115 FPS. So we got close to that 120 mark, but this was, again, in the Resurgence game mode, so, take that how you wish. Then we tried still a fan favorite, Apex Legends. Now, Apex Legends, still a pretty popular game. It's not as popular as it used to be, but I've heard they've had some good seasons lately, and I see a lot more about it on Twitter than I used to, and people are still searching for it on YouTube, because, I check those things. We used max settings 1080p, and we were able to get around 100 to 115 FPS, but where we really saw this thing shine is where we let our CPU do a little bit more work, and we lower the settings down to completely low settings. And on low settings, we got 160 to 180 FPS. Not bad for 6 gigs of VRAM. Now, the wrinkle we decided to throw in here was the First Descendant. Now, First Descendant is a newer game, it's free to play, and it was really searched for some reason. The 1660 Super, like when I looked to try to figure out what games I should test for these graphics cards, I look for things that people look for on the internet, and First Descendant was one of them. So if you don't skip over this part, this is the First Descendant FPS numbers at 1080p. Ultra settings, we got 35 to 40 FPS. High settings, we got like 48 to 50-ish. Medium settings, we got like 60 to 65 FPS, but then when we bumped it down to low settings, we got pretty close to 100 FPS. And we also threw in CyberPunk 2077 just to, stress the graphics card out. We ran it at 1440p just for fun. We used ultra settings with the built-in upscaler, that's the default settings for a CyberPunk, and we got like 30 FPS, which I was actually really shocked by. And then we tried 1080p Ultra. Again, the default settings turns on the upscaler, and we got 55 FPS, so you could definitely tweak that and get 60. If you like to see these older graphics cards like the 1660 Super, things that were released a few years ago that are not as popular on benchmarking channels, if you like to see these sort of, real world benchmarks in games that people actually play, hit that subscribe button, because we do it pretty often. Now we tried some esports titles like Valorant, CS2, and of course good old Fortnite. In CS2, it's a little bit more demanding than the original CS, and the, counter to that, which is Valorant. It's a little bit harder to run, but not too terrible, just depends on what settings you use. So we only tried this at 1080p, and on the very high settings, their max settings, we got like 100 to 120 FPS. Then of course we lowered it down to high settings to see how that changed our FPS numbers, and that got us around 160 to 170, so that gets us close to those 165 hertz monitors that are pretty popular. And just to see how much we could squeeze out of it, we lowered the settings all the way down, and we were able to get around like 200 to 240 FPS. Now again, all of these esports titles are going to be drastically affected by what CPU you have in your gaming computer. So the weaker your processor is, you might have different FPS numbers, but as long as you have a decent one, you should get pretty close. Then we tried Valorant because, Valorant's really easy to run. Most people will say it could run on a potato. So we tried it at high settings, 4K, 1440p, and 1080p. In 4K, we got like 100 to 120 FPS. In 1440p, we got over 200, close to that 240-ish mark at times. And at 1080p, we crushed it. Like it was like 250 to 300 pretty much the whole time that we were playing, and I think that's pretty awesome. If you like Valorant. And of course, we gotta save the best for last. Good old Fortnite. It's the new season, chapter 5, season 4 maybe. I don't know. At least the car thing's gone. But we tried it at 4K, 1440p, and 1080p on DX12 and performance mode. On DX12 first, 4K, now we used the performance settings. That's like everything turned off, view distance, we put that at like far, and we got like 60 to 70 FPS, which 6 gigs of VRAM, 4K, that's pretty crazy. I know it's a CPU-based game, but just let me have it in the comments. At 1440p though, on the same DX12 settings, we got like 140 to 150 FPS, and at 1080p, we were able to get close to 200, like 180 to 200 FPS. But where this shines the most in Fortnite is on performance mode. Now, I know a lot of people knock the 1% lows on performance mode, but if you watch our little MSI overlay throughout the gameplay that I'm about to show you, you will notice that the 1% lows on performance mode were much better than you might think. And this is without the FPS cap. That would make the 1% lows go up just a smidge. Again, starting at 4K, we got like 120-ish FPS, and then dropping it down to 1440p, which I really think Fortnite at 1440p, even on the performance settings, looks pretty good. We got like 230-ish to 250. Depending on what's going on the map, it may drop down here or there. And 1080p, we got over 240 FPS, sometimes even pushing 300. Again, it all depends on what's going on in Fortnite and how much is, happening in the game and what part of the map you're on. But, it'll all vary. Overall, I think this graphics card is pretty awesome, but everybody says this one's better, so if you want to see a different one, go watch this.